I'm Craig, founder and CEO of HyperCube, and welcome to the HyperQast podcast. We've got Derek from Tenable here. So why don't you give yourself a little bit of an introduction, Derek?
Sure, absolutely, Craig. Derek Melber. I am let's see if I get this right, the Chief Technology and Security Strategist over here at Tenable, and focus on Tenable AD, but also focus on the other Tenable suite as well.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to the podcast. I have a ton of questions as they relate to Active Directory, but before we get into that, I was digging into your history a little bit. You know what I could find on LinkedIn and Google.
I tried to clean that up.
Only the good stuff, I promise. Whoever you paid to scrub the internet did a pretty good job.
That's good.
But doing my research, I found you published a book called Understanding and Designing Your Active Directory Infrastructure back in 2001. So I was wondering if you could just walk me through your first encounter with the Active Directory product and what problems it solved for you when you first encountered it. And from there, we can just kind of go through the evolution of that product over the years.
Yeah, that's an interesting place to start, and that's good. So, Active Directory came around in 2000. One of my very first engagements, I was actually doing a variety of things back then, was a pretty large migration from Windows NT to Windows 2000 Active Directory. It was for TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. So pretty large environment, pretty detailed environment because they had nuke plants. And, one of the things that they wanted to do was make administration easier, right? Windows NT was kind of crummy with that. And so using what's called delegation inside of Active Directory, as well as group policy within Active Directory, they were going to solve that. So they wanted to move from kind of a, entry-level Windows NT network operating system to something that was more robust, and an Active Directory allowed them to do that with delegation and group policy.
Sure. So what exactly is delegation and group policy? Like, I'll tell you what my understanding of it is, and you can correct me where I'm wrong.
Okay.
So like delegation, that's where you can push updates to a machine. Am I right about that? Or is that, well, I'll tell you what, you explain what the two are and then I'll ask a question.
Okay. So delegation is the idea that I'll give you two perfect examples. You have a help desk staff, and one of the main things in a corporate environment is no one can remember their password. So employees call the help desk and say, hey, I don't remember my password. So you can delegate to the help desk the ability to reset passwords for employees, right?
Okay.
And you can do it piecewise. So let's say that you are a worldwide organization and you only want the help desk in the USA to be able to reset passwords for USA employees. And likewise, you only want the Australian help desk to be able to modify the password for Australian employees. That would be delegation, and then getting down into the details with that. A second example would be, let's say that you have a project-oriented organization. You have a lot of projects come up. And so each of the managers are responsible for designing who can do what on the project. So instead of constantly calling IT to say, hey, can you put Bob in this project group and you can put Sally in this other project group, we'll just delegate to the manager the ability to modify group membership for that project. And so you're basically you're spreading the load of who can manage what within Active Directory. And those are the two primary delegations, which would be password reset and group modification. But of course, some organizations really blow it out and give you a lot of control over a lot of things, because you can get to the attribute level, right? If I trusted you a lot, Craig, I could say, okay, Craig, you can change the zip code for these 3 employees and that's it, right? I could get to that level if I wanted to.
Gotcha.
So that's delegation. And Windows NT, as kind of a comparison, had zero of that. You could do it or you couldn't. That's it. And it was for every employee, everyone in Active Directory. Group policy is a much more complicated aspect. So group policy came out of what was called system policy, right? And system policy was available in Windows NT, and it was all registry modifications. So, I could tweak the registry here. And of course, inside the registry, you can control applications and desktop features and stuff like that. So Microsoft improved that and made it group policy. And with group policy, you can modify the registry settings. You can modify security settings, which actually much of them aren't stored in the registry. You can deploy software. And you can control other aspects of the operating system, like control panel, what people can do and see, and different things like that. In today's group policy, there's over 5,000 individual settings in one GPO. And group policy applies to users and computers and can be linked to organizational units. So very similar to the delegation idea, I can have a single group policy object have 1,000 settings that only applies to one user. Now, you would never do that, but I'm just saying that's how granular it can get. A lot of control, a lot of power, and completely customizable.
Okay, so the idea with group policy is, I guess that's another powerful thing about Active Directory. So I'm sitting at my Windows computer. If that Windows computer is joined with Active Directory, then when I log in, I'm not actually just logging in locally, I'm also logging into Active Directory. And based on whatever based on my identity as a user, Active Directory will then push down security settings to the physical computer that I'm sitting on.
Yep.
And
so, I mean, if we walk through that process, and you actually don't log on locally and to Active Directory. In a corporate environment, you really want everyone just to log on to AD, right? So when I put in my credentials, right, Control Delete, username, AD username, put in my password. Password, username goes to a domain controller. Domain controller says, yes, this is correct. And then it pushes your user settings from group policy at that time once you've authenticated. The computer actually gets its settings when it boots up. And it actually boots up. It does an auth as well to a domain controller. And as soon as that occurs, it gets those settings. So by the time the user gets there, the computer has all the settings that it needs for registry, for security, for whatever it is. Yep.
Okay. And so in that case, group policy sounds like a huge time saver, because like you said earlier, someone's working on a project. There's a whole bunch of security settings that go along with that project. I can just add them to the security group for that project. I can add them to the group policy for that project, and they get all the settings. Not really?
No, not really. Okay. No, that's a little bit different. That's a cool idea, though. That's a cool idea. But so project wise, and so that would be awesome. But so group policy establishes more of what the user experience is on their desktop, laptop, and when they use that. Okay. So it's kind of whatever they're using, right? It's whatever's in front of them. When you start talking about the project aspect, usually those files that are project centric are stored somewhere on a server, right? Yeah. Some storage device. So that storage device has the actual configurations there on who can do what. And normally group policy doesn't deal with that aspect of things. It's only for that environment.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've kind of got basically at a really high level, just to make sure I understand what's going on here. Active Directory exists to help several things. Step number one, it authenticates both users and devices. Yep. And then step number two, it can once it authenticates who you are and what device you're using, it takes care of managing all the security, let's call them policies, for you using that particular device.
Yes, it definitely does that. And then the third thing that I would add in is back to the delegation piece, right? It helps with efficiency of management of everything in AD, right? You have users, you have groups, you have organizational units, you have group policy objects, and then you have other ancillary settings around AD. And the way that AD works is you have the ability to delegate that out and manage that more efficiently. Bless you.
Gotcha. Okay. So Active Directory, rather than me being the solo sysadmin trying to manage 1,000 users, I can take parts of my responsibility and delegate them to other people, and they can help
That's correct.
manage
That's
stuff
correct.
underneath.
Yeah, and that's from an efficiency standpoint, also from a siloing standpoint or isolation, right? You want to make sure that the right people are managing the right objects. And maybe a help desk employee shouldn't have the ability to, reset the password for the CEO. That maybe isn't the best decision.
Fair enough.
So, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, that actually greatly helps improve my understanding of Active Directory. Now let's talk about Active Directory and sort of its evolution from 2001. So what's the first big, let's call it, update you remember from there?
So the first thing that jumps into my mind when you ask that is, so when Microsoft released Active Directory in 2000, the password policy, which is part of group policy, didn't require a password. So for 3 years, organizations normally went with 0 passwords for users. So we've come a long way in 21 years, right?
Yeah.
So the very first thing that comes to my mind was in 2003, Microsoft implemented a password policy by default. And we still live with that today, right? 7-character minimum password. You have to have complexity requirements. You can only have the password for 42 days by default, and then you have to reset it, all these things. So that was the very first thing that I remember kind of as this major, like, wow, look at what Microsoft is doing. And that was in 2003.
Gotcha. All right. I know these days that I always conflate Windows Server and Active Directory together because they kind of run on the same thing.
Yep.
Does Active Directory do anything in managing all the services that a Windows Server can supply? Like, like file shares and DNS and DHCP and all that stuff?
So when AD, so let's parse them out because you hit quite a few there, right? So let's first of all talk about DHCP. That's the easiest one, and the answer is no, right? AD doesn't really do anything with DHCP. It obviously uses it, right, but DHCP is kind of its own little.
So that's just like a totally separate service that a Windows server can supply to the network it's plugged into.
Yep. The Windows server would supply that service, and then whoever wants to consume DHCP, right? And I can consume all or none of the IP configurations, can do that. And of course, just to kind of throw it out there, most servers, right, since we're talking about servers, would have a static IP address.
Yeah.
Okay. So normally it's just your endpoints that would consume DHCP.
Right.
Now let's go to DNS. So when Microsoft moved from Windows NT to Active Directory, DNS became exceptionally important because the way that devices and users find things is they use what's called an SRV record, a service locator record. And these service locator records are stored in DNS. And so now you can't have AD without DNS. And so there was a pretty distinguished decision for most organizations, not all, most organizations, that we're going to use Microsoft DNS because now we can integrate AD and DNS together. And actually the DNS database is stored within a domain controller. So it runs on a domain controller, and now you have the great benefits, a lot of good benefits with DNS integrated with Active Directory. But AD doesn't control it. It's still controlled through DNS, but now it's more joined together. And then there's, sites, AD sites are in there, your domain controllers, Kerberos, all of those are SRV records.
Okay.
You also mentioned controlling services on servers. And you actually can do that. Inside of group policy, there is a services area that you can control whether a service starts running, disabled, whatever. You can actually have some other controls around that service. Most people don't use it. It's not the easiest thing to do. Usually a server admin would do that, whoever's in charge of that server, but you can control services through Active Directory via group policy.
Okay, interesting. When I was using the word services, I was referring to, so like I'm a user, the typical services I expect when I plug into a corporate network are like file sharing. Maybe there's maybe in addition to file sharing, there's an FTP server out there that I can upload things to. Other services, there might be a website hosted somewhere on my network that I can get to that's like internal corporate stuff I can't get out, those type of things.
So in that list, right? So file sharing is pretty much inevitable, right? We have to have file sharing, otherwise no one can work. So that's going to be there. But if we talk about like FTP, right? So I can, through group policy, say that server allows FTP to run, right? And so I can do that. I can also say, okay, this server is going to allow IIS to run, and it's going to be, when the server starts, it's going to launch and make IIS running, right? And any other service, right? So let's say that I have a developer's machine. It's not a server, but it's a developer machine, and they're running application A. Well, okay, that runs as a service. I can launch that. The SQL servers, SQL, that runs as a service. And so I can get those services. Now, what I can't really do with group policy in AD is control the service settings. I can't go in and say, okay, I'm going to configure this website through Active Directory and group policy, and boom, all of a sudden the website on server 4 is a new website. That would be done through the service portal, in this case, like IIS or something like that.
Okay, so I would have as an example. Actually, maybe this is a question. So in a typical corporation, that's an on-prem Windows Active Directory environment. Would I have different servers for the different services, and then those different servers, when they boot up, would call back home to Active Directory and say, what permissions do I have? What am I allowed to run?
So it's, in my opinion, always ideal to separate things out, right? Yeah. We definitely want a DC to do DC work, right? Yep. We want the SQL server to do SQL server work. We want the file servers to do file server work. We want the print servers to do print server work. Usually, the smaller the organization, the more it's shared. And as you grow,
all that is run on the same computer.
Then you have isolated machines to do that. So what will happen is the server boots up, it will authenticate, group policy will be applied, mostly to configure the registry and security settings, but it might toggle some services to say, okay, don't run these services, but make sure these services start. And then as far as permissions, so I'm gonna go branch here. So permissions within the folder structure can be done in group policy. What a nightmare, though. That's rarely done. But there's another area that people often call privileges, which allows things to be done on that server. They're called user rights. Those are also distributed from group policy. Some examples of user rights: the ability to log on locally, right? To walk up to the keyboard and log on locally. The ability to access over the network, right? To be able to do what you're saying as a user. Hey, I need a file. Can I access that server? Backup files and folders would be a user right. Change the system time. There's about 35 of them, and they're all very machine-centric, very powerful capabilities. And those can also be controlled through group policy.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that all makes sense. Up next, I wanted to talk about, like, let's get into some of the juicy stuff. So over the years, there's been lots of exploits, particularly as it relates to Active Directory. Can you walk us through some of the highlights that you remember, or I guess they wouldn't necessarily be highlights, but so much as moments of sheer terror and panic as you've encountered some of these Active Directory exploits over the years?
So the first thing again that comes to my mind when you ask the question really wasn't an exploit, but I think it's good to talk about. It was a patch from Microsoft that blew up Wins. So, back in the day, administrators were taught don't patch, right? So when we start talking about patching today to a Windows person, they're like, oh no, I don't want to patch, right? And it's proliferated, right? I mean, today we have so many machines that aren't patched because, as an administrator, your thought is if I patch it, it could break it. And sure, now it's secured, but now it doesn't function. So the very first thing that came to my mind was in the early 2000s, Microsoft released a pretty big patch and it blew up Wins. And so all the Wins servers just went tumbling down throughout the world.
Gotcha.
And it took quite a while.
Wins? I don't remember what that service does.
So Wins and DHCP kind of help each other out, right? Okay. So think of it this way. DHCP is all IP related, right? It's IP address and it's default gateway. Wins is Windows Internet Naming Service. So it's the name. So it names the IP to the name that's in Active Directory or for that machine. So it keeps track of the name. So that way you can query the IP or you can query the name of the machine. Okay. And so obviously if you have scripts and everything running on the name of the machine and not the IP, then and Wins isn't there, you're not going to get anywhere. So things just kept crumbling. The next thing that comes to my mind, and I don't remember what year this was, but something called Red Button. And Red Button was actually found by Mark Mayfrey, if I have that detail correct. It was very interesting. I was able to speak with Mark Mayfrey a little bit through my journey in my career. And, Red Button was one of those things that, you basically could get administrative access almost instantaneously on a machine. And it was so scary that everyone was, oh my gosh, we're going to get taken over. And often they were because it was posted. Mark at the time was a bad guy. And story is that Microsoft kind of said, okay, do you want the red pill or the blue pill? do you want to go to jail or do you want to, take to the good side? And Mark kind of flipped and became, very prolific in the Windows industry as a good guy. But that was the first thing that kind of came to my mind back in the day when really hacking wasn't that common. Prevalent. That was one of the first things that I remember.
Yeah. Do you remember when that was?
I want to say it was around 06 to 09, something in that time frame.
Okay.
I'm going to guess. Maybe even before that. It might have been before that because I was first introduced to Mark, I want to say in 07 to 09. So maybe it was before that, 04 or 05. Yeah.
Okay. So that I wonder if hacking hadn't become so prevalent yet because not every single computer was connected to the internet. These days.
That's part of it.
Yeah. These days, literally everything most things don't even work if you don't connect them to the internet anymore.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, I downloaded an application the other day and I couldn't get it to register because it wasn't on the internet. It was running on my isolated VM. And I'm like, geez, it was very frustrating, but you're right. I have to get to the internet. I want to make sure that I'm using, getting licensing and everything's being tracked and all that stuff from a vendor standpoint.
Gotcha. So to sort of pull on that thread for a little bit, do you remember how they fixed Red Button? Did Microsoft put out a patch or?
Oh yeah. Yep. And that might have been kind of the beginning of critical patching, right? So back in the day, there was no such thing as a critical patch, right? You didn't have tiers. It was just everything is wrapped into one. And so you had patches and service packs, and service packs were very important because, back then Windows 2000, 2003, Active Directory was newer. So service packs became a huge piece of making sure that things were up to a certain point, right? So a service pack would include all of the patches from the last service pack plus new stuff. And so service packs were extremely important, but of course, still just as lethal as a patch to break something.
Yeah.
And so that might have been kind of the beginning of Microsoft thinking, we really need to have another level beyond just a patch and just a service pack. And these are things that you must. I mean, if we tell you to do this, this is a must because it's going to fix a vulnerability that needs to be patched right now.
Yep, gotcha. So I know just prior to Tenable, you were working at an Active Directory security company that got acquired. Can you talk about how'd you end up there, I guess, basically?
Yeah, so I mean, I've had a very interesting career. If I take a couple of steps back, I was actually in graduate school getting my doctorate in structural engineering. And, I did a lot of work with computers, and that's kind of where I got involved with computers. And then I went into training. So I did a lot of training, and then I went into admin. And then I kind of went into consulting and more evangelism, I would call it, right? So I would work for companies and I would do presentations and I would put white papers together for them. And so then I took that piece and I kind of did that for a company. And so for about 6 years before working for Alsid, I was a worldwide evangelist. So I would go to over 25 countries a year doing about 125 presentations a year. And that it was kind of the foundation of me building this evangelism piece. And evangelism to me is outward facing communication, right? It's blogs, white papers, webinars, video, seminars, anything that is kind of educating the community and kind of giving them a solution around what you're educating them about, right? And so I came to Alsid doing that. And that's what I did for Alsid up until the point that they were acquired by Tenable. And then I went from working for Tenable AD. Now I just work for Tenable, and I kind of support all of the suite that Tenable offers, from vulnerability management, Tenable AD, and a slight on Tenable OT, operational technology, which they do have a really solid team that kind of already does a lot of that stuff, especially in the US. So I don't do as much with that, but kind of building this, and it's kind of new. It's been, I think, 5-6 months, and it's been a great ride so far.
Oh, spectacular. So after Red Button, what's the next big exploit? We're getting closer to where I started getting into exploitation. So I was working at Raytheon at the time, and that was my encounter. I started working with the Raytheon cyber teams and started building course material around different exploits. My knowledge of all that stuff starts right around Eternal Blue. But
so I with what I was doing in my career, I wasn't as much focused on the exploits as helping organizations with the built-in stuff. Let me give you an example. In my career, I have talked about passwords, securing and hacking passwords, probably more than I ever want to talk about again. So I talked a lot about NTLM and LAN manager and how those could be exploited, hacked, and then what you could do to improve the security. And it was more than just LAN manager, NTLM, moving to NTLM v2 and Kerberos. It was for an organization, right? And I'll just expand a little bit on this because it is an important still today. Yeah. So let's say that you run an application that's critical to the organization, but the application authenticates and only authenticates using LAN manager. With the way Windows is built up until about 2016, and maybe 2012, the only thing that you could do was secure all the other users because they had to support LAN manager. It was just you supported Land Manager or not. It was an on-off switch. And if one account needed Land Manager, it had to be on.
Yep.
So, this is the kind of thing that I instructed organizations. Okay, back in the day, this is how you secured it. And then inside of group policy, they created new policies to separate it out to where these users don't use Land Manager and these users do, right? And so now it's better. But throughout my career, I've talked about helping organizations because, cracking passwords, if you look even today, what is the number one way that the attackers get in? It's through someone's password, right? It's either through the RockU, where they posted billions of passwords out on the internet.
I'm familiar with that
or
list.
using, brute force attacks, or, now we have password spraying. They're always coming up with new ways to not be detected, to not trigger things, and still get the password. And so passwords are still one of the major ways that attackers get in. And so it's still important today to focus on that. So I've done a tremendous amount of that. And then, of course, SMB also started to get hacked. And then we had to get different levels of SMB. And so some of the built-in things is where I spent a lot of my time helping organizations understand them and what they could do with what they had versus the vulnerabilities. Because the vulnerability, the one thing about it is it's an on-off switch, right? If there's a vulnerability, you apply a patch and you're done. Well, one of the things we talk about at Tenable AD a lot are misconfigurations, because I need to authenticate. So I have to have some authentication protocol. And if I disable NTLM and then something breaks, well, I have to have NTLM. So how do I function with something that's insecure and make everything secure? And so that's a lot of what I've done in my career.
Right. So I don't know if this is a halfway decent analogy, but so the Active Directory is insanely powerful. And it's not just that, oh no, there's some magical hack that lets me break into Active Directory. It's a really powerful tool. You have to configure it and set it up right, or nothing related to getting hacked, can take you down.
Yep. And it's wide and deep. It is. It's wide and deep.
Yeah.
And, one of the things, I just did a webinar this week. I don't remember what day. I don't even know what day today is. But I did a webinar on like the top 5 things you need to secure. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to guess that 3 of the 5, the audience had never heard of before. But those 3 things are on the top of the list for the attackers to enumerate. So when they enumerate, they're going after these because, well, most people don't know they need to secure them. And in almost every case, they're insecure. So these are easily exploitable things that every organization needs to secure. And again, that's what I do a lot of my role now with Tenable is helping organizations kind of fill those gaps. What are the attackers doing? Let's look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and decrypt it. And let's tie that to Active Directory and flush out what they're needing. And so helping fill those gaps really is going to, keep my fingers crossed, get us to that point where we've increased security of all of our Active Directory environments.
Yep. Well, I think that's a pretty good spot to kind of end on and leave our listeners wanting something a little more. So what are those top 5 things? And then the next time we chat, we'll dig into them.
That sounds great.